engaged on that. And, we'll talk more about it, but I'm glad the governor did the right thing. And I think we're on live now, right, Abraham? Excellent. So, Senator, just by way of starting things off, I'm going to read you what I wrote to introduce this episode, and then we'll ask you to talk a little bit more about yourself. So here's what I wrote. You can see you're already dealing with an ego. I'm reading my own words to begin with. In any case, if you have skin in the cannabis game, you best care about what moderate Republicans think on the subject. We know that most Democratic elected officials generally support some level of cannabis legalization. More conservative Republican officials are less enthused. If you want some measure of bipartisan consensus on the issue, and really most of us do, then the thoughtful, moderate Republicans are probably your most critical audience. And so State Senator Jason Barickman is one of the rising stars of the Illinois Republican Party. He is a moderate and credible voice in the Illinois General Assembly. As a Republican co-sponsor of the cannabis legalization legislation, he had significant influence on the resulting law. His legislative chops and collaborative approach put him in a unique position, and host Abraham Villegas and I look forward to having him live on the medical cannabis community to get his perspective on the future of cannabis policy in Illinois. So I'll let Abraham give a quick welcome to the army of people he talks to, he manages.
I won't take up too much time. Thank you guys for joining us on another cannabis conversation today early in the morning. We apologize for our short notice and in our events that we've been putting together, but we appreciate you guys being flexible in the schedule and joining us as the story continues to unfold. So today we'll be getting some insights from Illinois Senator Jason Barickman, and we're interested to see what everybody in the entire state is talking about as it relates to social equity in cannabis. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Mark so that we can get started.
Great. And again, Senator, welcome. I just read you a little blurb, so you're pretty clear on what our agenda is. I guess I will just start by asking you, before we get into the cannabis stuff, just to talk a little bit about, you're Senator Barickman, you're Leader Barickman, you have an important role to play in the Senate. Tell us about your title. Tell us what that means. Tell us what kinds of issues and committees you lead and are important to you on the Republican side. Tell us a little about your district, and then we'll get into the pot stuff.
Sure. So thanks, Mark and Abraham, for having me, and it's nice to be with everyone who's on the call, the Zoom, the live event. So I represent a large district in Central Illinois. I grew up on a family farm in Central Illinois. I'm a graduate of Illinois State University, the University of Illinois. I served in the Army National Guard, and I represent the 53rd Senate District, which stretches really from the center of the state, from Eureka. If people are familiar with where Eureka is, in Eureka College, east to the Indiana border, including, 70 or 80 different cities and municipalities, 6 counties, including a big chunk of Bloomington Normal, where I live with my wife and our 3 young children that are 4th grade, 2nd grade, and 3 years old, and navigating e-learning and the world that we live in. Our schools are entirely remote, so we're working through that the best that we can. I serve, as Mark said, I serve in the Senate and serve on our Republican leadership team there. I serve on some of the committees that I think deal with the primary issues of the day faced by the state. So I'm on things like the Judiciary Committee, the Executive Committee, our Education Committee. You think of most of the big issues of the day that work through the legislative process they're bound to come through one of those three committees, cannabis being no exception to that. Just, kind of as an approach to kind of bring us into the issue of the day. I'm a guy who grew up thinking that government has a role, but it's designed to be limited in nature. And so as I approached the debate that we embarked on really for a few years, but as we embarked on the debate over our state's policies regarding cannabis use, I had an eye towards that limited role of government, the proper role. And I positioned myself in a manner, as you said, Mark, that allowed me to weigh in heavily in how Illinois legalized cannabis. Ultimately, it's a collaborative process, right? You work with members on the other side of the aisle, you work with the governor, and you try to come forward with something that people can agree to and that takes a step forward in terms of the direction that our state ought to go. So I've been glad to be a part of that process with cannabis and with a whole host of other big issues that we've worked through in our state. So thanks for having me today.
Well, thank you. And also, again, want to a shout out to Silas Scott on your team. He is really great at handling stressed, panicked phone calls from me and rescheduling, due to major announcements and court cases. And I really appreciated working with him. I think he's a good representative for the Barickman brand name. So if he's watching,
he gets lots of experience, Mark, dealing with stressed, frantic phone calls from his boss too. So good training ground for taking your calls.
Excellent, absolutely. So, Senator, I think I wanted to talk some about just cannabis policies in general. And again, my thesis is folks like you who are sort of middle ground, who don't necessarily love the idea of legalized cannabis for its own sake, but also understand that, like so many other things, maybe government is not the best arbiter of, people's choices. So I want to talk about all that. But first, obviously, we sort of have, the elephant in the room, the dispensary license issues that have come to fore. I'm sure you've been tracking what's in the media. I'm sure you've been tracking what the governor has said. Actually, I'm curious to know what you think about it. I'm curious to know whether there's been any dialogue among your colleagues about it and sort of what the Republican zeitgeist is. I mean, are people calling you saying, aha, I told you they'd screw it up? So, or not, so what's going on the R end? Because we've been talking to some Ds, obviously they've got a lot of skin in the game, but again, this law would look the same, for better or for worse, without your influence. So where are you?
Yeah, so that's a great probing question. I think, obviously I can't speak for all Republicans' view of what's been in the news over the last several days, but by and large, I think it's more like this. The questions I'm fielding from Republicans and my colleagues are more of what in the world's going on? Like, there's some mess that's spilling out in the media, and help me make sense of it. And so that's by and large what the discussions have been. It's not I don't think there's an accusatory tone to, who did things right or wrong. And there's not necessarily a clear direction, I think, coming from Republicans about what the right answer is to where you go from here. It's just an understanding of, or trying to understand what exactly is happening.
It sounds like you've had, sorry, I forget, but if I don't mute myself, I can talk forever. It sounds like you've had some experience lately explaining this situation to some people, reaching out to you, going, what's going on? So while we're at it, this will probably be viewed a few thousand times before it sort of recedes into web history. So help all of us understand, I mean, and I don't mean to be too flippant about this, but help me understand from your perspective what's going on.
Well, and right, I think one of the things I appreciate about the General Assembly is there's lots of different perspectives. We each have our own that comes from our experiences and our vantage point. And so mine may be unique. I don't know. My assessment of what's happening is the legislature and the governor, when we set about to negotiating the legislation that became law regarding cannabis, one of the very significant issues then was a discussion about how you ensure that the successful applicants at the end of the road here are representative of the demographics of our state. I will say, maybe that isn't the way they all characterized it, but there was a belief, and I think rightfully so, and a concern rightfully so, that all of the licenses for these cannabis type, industry across the country really were being held by, certain people at the exclusion of other people. And so there was a lot of discussion about how you really break that up. And from the onset, I believe that's a very difficult thing to do. I'm a kind of a free market guy. I think when government tries to pick and choose winners and losers, the end result can often be messy. And so fast forward to today, I think we're seeing the mess of it. And the mess of it is people are stepping back and they're looking and they're saying, why did this group win and this, or get awarded a license and this group did not? And they're questioning that process. Are there some improvements that can be made? Undoubtedly, that's the case. But again, Mark, I think it's important to recognize that for me, my starting point is one that is cautious about government picking winners and losers, because I think in more times than not, the result is going to be really messy.
And that's a good sort of philosophical groundwork. But I think, again, there are issues that are related to how well did the social equity provisions work, and how well did the intent of the law work. And I think that's part of the problem, really. And I guess, perhaps I'm spouting just so you pass it on to the people you're explaining to, but there are also really substantive scoring issues. So the way we've been talking about it is it's not like a do-over for some of these applicants. It's more of a do-right for the state. Let me give you a few examples. An applicant who did not submit proof of veteran status got veterans points. Another applicant who submitted very robust social equity evidence twice did not end up getting social equity points. Identical applications submitted, because the way it worked, you could take the same application and essentially keep buying darts to throw at the board, hoping you hit a bullseye. So you could take the same application, lots of people did, and that's why you only have 21 companies in the lottery, because some of them bought, 30 darts at 200, $2,500 a pop. But so identical applications got different scores in some cases. So, there's and again, I don't think there's, I think people, given everything in Illinois, when I started in the General Assembly, I used to get really angry at everyone, like they're trying to kill my legislation. I'm going to lecture them. And then most of the time I realized that they don't even know my name, but they don't care. They're just doing their job. And so what I really, right or wrong, so I took an Abraham Lincoln saying that I sort of repeat to myself just to calm myself down at the rail, which is, don't attribute to malice that which can be explained by stupidity. So and again, my words, not yours. But that is just, it's actually a way of saying, I don't think these people intended any ill intent. I don't think there was, like necessarily an attempt to fix the process, or at least, if there was, it was like the worst attempt ever. But you do have a guy from KPMG, the scoring company, on one of the winning teams. So again, it's just really important, is it not, to set aside sort of the philosophical trailer bill, where do we want to go from here kinds of issues, to set them apart from sort of, man, they just really royally, just clerical, like nobody just want to even, it's like submitting a press release that's full of typos. You'd probably, have a serious conversation with the staff person that did that, times a million here. I mean, this is $1 billion worth of licenses we're talking about. So, is everybody clear that we're not just doing this because there are philosophical differences, but there are actual screw ups that, should be fixed?
Oh yeah. I think, and if that was a takeaway from my prior comments, I would say don't take it that way. I'm simply, I think it's worth acknowledging the challenge any government has. And then you have to look specifically at what's here. I think the KPMG thing, that's like, it's such a head scratcher. You wonder, how in the world did we get there? How did KPMG get there? I mean, that KPMG is a large consulting firm, an accounting firm, right? They presumably should have processes and procedures in place. There was clearly a breakdown somewhere. And look, whether that employee had an actual impact on the manner in which the applications were scored, you got to look at it, because the public, rightfully so, looks at this and says, they question it, and they say, how is it that there could be some kind of independent review if an employee from the reviewer had their hat in the ring? It just defies logic, and it's very unfortunate. But the result is you got to dig into that, and you've got to remedy that, because there's going to be an immediate lack of confidence that exists from the community, because that one's just too easy to understand. I mean, it's just too simple. Anyone in the world can understand why that was a total failure and breakdown.
Yeah, I think just in terms of, like I started my political career, working for Jan Schakowsky while I was in college, and then, working for Alderman Joe Moore in Chicago as his political director. So one of the first things I taught myself was, if I was going to have a meeting for 20 people and I knew 20, 25 people were coming, I wasn't going to put out more than 10 chairs. Because, I never mind interrupting a meeting, because it's standing room only and we need to bring more chairs in. Whereas if you put out 20 chairs and 10 get filled, then you're a loser. So to me, it's all, sort of, I hope that makes sense, right? And so to me, it's always in part a perception of marketing, managing expectations, and communication. And my thesis is that I'm not sure who was in charge of communication, but that was just a huge dropped ball, because you sort of just never kept anybody in the loop in the process, kept changing the game by issuing, second version of the application, then answers to answers that sometimes conflicted each other. So do you think that what's happening now and like what the governor is doing is sufficient? Is that the right way? Number one, but the bigger question is, can you judge? Has anyone actually communicated with you, given your very visible role on this issue, given that in this state, we want this to be a bipartisan issue because frankly, that's the way, I work for the industry. And for me, this is a clear matter of we all do better off in all sorts of ways if there's, broad agreement with moderates, from all sides sort of saying, yeah, this is what we can live with. By the way, I don't agree with everything that you espoused either. And, we can talk about that. I mean, home grow for everyone or home grow for patients or home grow for no one, like I'm sure that's probably a sore point. Some of the people that are watching you now, and we can talk about that because I think they're legitimate views, whichever way you seem to believe. But do you have the information you need to form a view? And what do you wish you would know, and who do you wish was talking to you? And hopefully, who do you wish talks to you before we get to veto session or next session?
Okay, so a lot to unpack there, and I want to make sure that
You're like my psychiatrist.
yeah. So I want to make sure I don't forget the home grow piece because I'm not sure what you think my opinion is on home grow.
Okay.
But it sounds like you may have a misunderstanding.
Okay.
So,
Very good. This is why we do this.
Yeah. So let's first the process. There was clearly a breakdown. Look, the legislature passes a law. We kind of hand it off to the administration and we say go. There's an acknowledgement this is brand new, this is going to be challenging, but there was obvious, and we hit COVID, but there was clearly some breakdown that resulted in this lengthy time period. We were very delayed on the outcome of the process, and I cannot stand here, Mark, or sit here, Mark, and tell you that I have a deep understanding of what the breakdown was. I do know that there was some concerns during the process about how the administration would handle tie-break situations. Now we obviously see that that's like a really significant issue, and I'm not sure that anyone looks at the way the scoring was done and thinks that it was done in a manner that was fair, let's say. So some huge breakdowns there. I think the legislature will probably learn a lot more about that. I think as we look to the next round, the legislature will likely become more engaged in that because we have views that we want to see represented in the process, right? All that said, I've not heard from the administration. I've not heard from the governor on this. I don't know where he's looking for our assistance, and that's an important question to know. Does he want to just continue to fly down the path that he's on, or does he want input from those who tried to help initially, right? That's for him to answer. If he wants our help, I think many of us are willing to give it. I think this should be a collaborative process. And in the immediate sense, I can't tell you, Mark, where we're going. I saw what the governor put out. He's going to do a re-review, I suppose. I'm going to hold my comment to that until I see the out. He didn't ask me how to re-review it. He said, this is what I'm going to do. So we'll see if the re-review. Here's the one thing I do know. There's lawsuits already. Unfortunately, I suspect there will be more. A re-review could instigate even more litigation. Doesn't mean it's not worth doing because what I see is the industry lacks confidence in the outcomes here. And I think having confidence as we move forward is a really critical component, because if there's no confidence, we're just going to have more of the mess. And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for the state, the industry, the people who are looking for this to be successful, right? So anyway, that's kind of that.
Yeah.
What did I leave out?
I guess, hopefully the takeaway point being that those of us who are, very interested in this issue, those of us who are, sort of stakeholders in this, hope that there are folks, in the administration and, having conversations with legislators whose, advice, help they might need. What about like, have you heard from constituents on this? I mean, so part of what I do, and I told you this before, is, I'm a cannabis lobbyist and consultant. I've helped people with applications. I've helped people in Central Illinois with applications. I have a great team that did not win in the dispensary round out of Peoria. And so for me, I was very surprised just how much of a Central and Southern Illinois issue it was, and not just sort of insider baseball for the Chicago folks. What's your impression of that? Have you been hearing from people at all?
So I announced, well before we even got to the negotiating table, that I had an open mind towards legalizing cannabis. Mind you, Mark, I represent a district that is very Republican, very conservative. Whoever the Republican nominee is at the top of the ticket over the last many election cycles wins by large margins in the district I represent. So if you say what are the views on cannabis generally, I would say that the district I represent is generally opposed to legalization. So what I did very early, I said I spoke publicly very early on this, and I framed the issue for my constituents in a manner that represented my priorities. And so I did a lot of town halls and I did a lot of interactions with my constituents. And those were fruitful. I mean, they led to great local community discussions. Today, I don't have, my phone's not ringing about cannabis for good or bad, right? I think that there has been an implementation. All of this is somewhat slow. It's not real widespread, but communities like I live in Bloomington, and Bloomington is in the process of, they're actually going through, I think, zoning and working on a location. But it is not instigating communications on either side, for or against. I think many of the people that I represent look at it, they kind of shrug their shoulders. They're either, whether they're for it or against it. It hasn't become a controversy, and that to me is good. From a political perspective, that's good.
Absolutely. I mean, as somebody, who's written campaign literature before, I can just see how this might play out. And really, that's part of I asked you this because I want people to have a context in terms of how your, thoughts on this have been shaped. But all right. So one more, I maybe sound distasteful. One more punch before I stop beating the dead horse. And that is with this process of currently applied for licenses. The other thing that's really, really hot here, or there's several things that are really hot. One is the role that the veterans preference played in the process. And it's sort of esoteric, but what happened was the owner needed to be, and we called them unicorns in my game. The owner needed to be an Illinois resident, veteran, social equity eligible applicant who owned at least 51% of the company. So the social equity thing was interesting. There were lots of people who were eligible for social equity. The veteran thing just screwed tons of people up because it's much harder to have a company that's 51% owned by a veteran who also is social equity eligible. So there are a lot of folks owned, and you know what? We have somebody I'm a fan of, Michael Malcolm, making the emphasizing that it has to be not 51% owned, but owned and controlled, as you guys wrote in the language. So that veterans preference really screwed people up. And by the way, I'm an immigrant to this country. I get choked up just talking about veterans. Freedom is not free, to use that old cliche, as I think. But I also, think it's a complete loser, sort of pitting the veterans lobby against the social equity lobby when you guys come to Springfield. So what's your thinking on that particular piece? Are you sort of aware of that as being a piece of the controversy that's bubbling up? To me, I see a very easy solution. Still give veterans points, but take them out of the 51%, make them like the union points. That way everybody goes out and gets a veteran, just like everybody went out and did a union peace agreement. They get the points, but the 51% remains just social equity, if that makes sense. I'm sorry. I do this all day, every day. So I'm going to, just minutia the heck out of you. But any thoughts on that, on the rub there, and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, I mean, I get the rub. I'm a veteran myself, and like you, look, supporting veterans is a really easy thing to understand. Go anywhere in the state and say, do you support veterans? And the answer is yes. I think the manner in which that got included is telling of the legislative process, right? Which is very imperfect, or has an imperfect result, right? The legislative process is all about how do you start with a good idea and add to that idea in a manner that adds votes to your proposal, with the goal in the Senate of getting 30 votes. And we had a very, very well-respected member on the Democratic side of the aisle who came forward, and it was kind of late in the process, and he said, "Hey, I recognize that there's no preference given for veterans, and that's very important to me." He made it. I remember the committee hearing where this came up. And Senator Staines, who I've worked with Senator Staines on some really tough issues, this being one of them. She's a great bill sponsor, really a very good friend of mine on the other side of the aisle. And I remember that hearing, and I remember her diligently taking notes about some of the feedback that she was getting. And I would just bet you that everyone in the room was like, "Oh yeah, veterans, makes sense. Put it in the bill." And it didn't get the depth of analysis that many of the other components did. And so the end result was you've got this scoring process that clearly created this line in the sand of whether you're a veteran or not. The control issue, of course, that was a big issue for other reasons. The thought that people were going to be circumventing the process, I suppose. And so there it is. Does the legislature address that? I think so. Nothing that we do is ever easy, and you can see that if people want to argue in the halls in the streets about whether the legislature should diminish the role of veterans in the cannabis industry, I suppose that's a path some could take. But I think it is logical for the legislature to look at that and ask ourselves whether we're getting the intended result, or if we can include some preference for veterans. Mark, you give a good suggestion. Can you do it in a way that doesn't unfairly weigh that against some of the other important criteria that we tried to put forward? And that, again, I think is the goal.
This is why you're the elected official and I'm not, because you put these things so artfully. I might have to have this transcribed so I can use some of that language when I represent some of my clients. But thank you. That's actually a really thoughtful approach, and it makes me feel better about the fact that there may well be a way to sort of not take away something from veterans, but maintain the integrity of the intent of the social equity part of this. And I think that's, sort of people like myself are hoping for. The last question about the current round: there are states sitting on, the state is sitting on infusion, craft grow, and transport licenses. Those applications were sent in. They were due in July 1st. Obviously, we know there were issues related to COVID and the governor's executive orders, and again, another poke at KPMG. Obviously, KPMG couldn't drive down to Springfield and pick up the applications because they had a COVID travel ban. So that delayed the process. So you got these licenses. From what I had heard, from what a lot of us heard, those licenses had been scored already and sort of were waiting to be released. People had gotten deficiency notices already and had responded to those. And we don't know where they are. They were supposed to come, July 1. People are, as you know, on the craft grow and infusion side, people actually have to have control of the property. They need to own the building or have an LOI. And, people are paying 10 grand a month just to, for the chance to control that building if they actually get a license. Now it seems that maybe the licenses aren't coming out. The administration has gone to take another look at them. I can't blame them. I would too. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are saying, well, given the, and sarcasm intended, the terrific job they did the first time, do we really want to give them another crack at it? A lot of my clients are saying, we want the results out now. We want them out in the daylight. We don't want any retroactive tweaking. Put it out, show us your work, and we'll take it from there. And again, at the same time, you want people to be careful and check for mistakes. So where are you on any of that? Do you think they'll come out soon? Do you want them to?
Me getting an understanding of what's inside the governor and his team's head is, I'm the last guy to make those predictions. I can tell you though, I think that there's a right answer here. I do agree. I think they need to issue those licenses. The one exception I would say to that is, or they need to tell the public what's going on. You can't do neither. You either issue the licenses in accordance with the law, or you explain, look, let's use the KPMG thing is just such an easy thing to understand. If the administration found out, look, there's a flaw in the process, there was a potential taint to the score, then the right thing to do is to disclose that and say, here's the process we're going to go through to fix that, and here's the timeline that we're on. We didn't have that with the previous license. Here we are with the craft grow and the others. I think some, what do you call it, transparency or just some, forthrightness suggests they issue the licenses or explain why they're not and set forth a new timeline. If they need help again from the legislature on that, I think we're a more than accommodating group who wants to see this done right. So engage us and we'll, again, collaborate and try to help where we can. But it can't just be silence.
All right. We'll end that. As I said, we'll stop beating that dead horse on that question. Back to sort of your broader perspective on cannabis legalization. And I asked you before about sort of the views of your district, because I think that's a very important context in terms of where, a moderate Republican like you would come from. Without my reiterating what I thought your position was, what was sort of your position, particularly on, because I thought where you had particular impact are issues like just what kind of crimes might be expunged. You had some impact on who gets to home grow and who doesn't. So what were your views on those things, and what agenda did you bring to the table when this was being negotiated?
Yeah, just, again, framing it. First of all, what I always said was there's a couple of things that brought me to the table. First, I thought that the prohibition on cannabis is an inefficient use of taxpayer money. I'm a Republican. I'm a fiscal conservative. People are always asking me, how do we spend our money better at the state level? Well, to me, this was a no-brainer. We're spending tons of dollars inefficiently prohibiting cannabis use. And so, kind of move that along. Second, I think that the prohibition on cannabis incentivized the illicit market, right? It put it in inappropriately so. So I think, we can help move that to a regulated market, which is more of the proper place for that. And third, I am a strong individual liberties guy. I believe people should make their own life choices. I think the government shouldn't be in the way of it. I think cannabis use, by and large, is an individual decision that individuals make, and having the government, involved there is something which I just thought was inappropriate. That brings me to the table. When you get to the table, you hash out the nuts and bolts of what it looks like. I was when the first meeting, I put my cards on the table. My cards were things that I think are easy for you and your followers here to understand. I said, look, we tax and regulate tobacco and alcohol. I said, I think we just pull that stuff and we look at what makes sense here. I said, I'm really concerned about our youth. I said, I think we can look at ways to replicate, especially with alcohol, how we handle our youth. And I said, I'm concerned about driving and the people who might use, whether it's alcohol or cannabis or some other substance, who might use and then drive and put people at risk. I said, I think, and that was a really big issue because there's not a great solution in that one. And so those were the issues I put on the table. Home grow was an issue that was kind of batted around at many different junctures. The discussion of home grow led to the fact that there was the home grow never added votes to the pot, right? The pot, maybe the wrong term. We're trying to get 30 votes. Adding home grow.
Or the right term.
Yeah, or the right term. But adding home grow never added votes to the proposal. I think it was Kelly Cassidy who came forward with kind of a compromise. I think most of the people at the negotiating table shrugged their heads and said, "Oh, the compromise is an A for effort. I don't know if it's the right answer," but we always looked at what adds to the votes. So Republicans never drew a line in the sand on home grow. I think there are those in law enforcement who did, but Republicans never said, here's how you get. We had a few votes to add. I was one of them, and we said we want to be part of the solution here. So I don't know where we're going to go as a state on home grow. I acknowledge very readily the fact that you can prohibit home grow. I don't know, what does that mean? You're gonna have cops knocking on the door and asking if you got a few plants inside or outside, or it's kind of this absurd situation. But the law is what it is, and I think there's many of us who probably have an open mind to how you revisit that when the opportunity arises.
And by the way, just speaking of home grow, and again, this is not a knock on anyone in particular, because there were a lot of us on the sort of around the rail who could have thought of this too, and nobody did. But it's just an interesting fact. I don't know if you know it, but the state provided for home grow for patients, but the state didn't provide for the sale of seeds.
Right. Yeah, I always called that the immaculate conception problem that exists with cannabis, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Not sure where it came from, but it came from somewhere, and now it's legal.
Well, and in this context, to me, immaculate conception is a libertarian concept.
There you go.
All right. Well, look, let's take some questions. And obviously, as I always say, this is not sort of to poke at anyone or to take arguments. We do get very active participation and a lot of questions. And since my wife will tell you I don't multitask, Abraham is kind enough to sort of be sifting through those while I yap. And Abraham, do we have, questions or, comments the senator can respond to?
As usual, we've got a lively conversation taking place in our live channels as well as in the chats of our Zoom. One of the most pressing issues that people have right now is that the current proposal that was submitted by the Pritzker administration only allows veterans who are social equity, who own 51%, to have that ultimate chance to participate in the lottery because they're the only people who technically qualify for these perfect scores. And so that current proposal is actually creating a much more limited market where only people who win are going to be the veterans who own 51%. And so as you mentioned, there's been a line drawn in the sand, and the administration proposed to allow for a cutoff score in the subsequent rounds, which would essentially resolve the veteran issue. It would resolve all of the lawsuits that are still pending in the other parts of the state, and would allow for true social equity applicants to have the chance that they were promised to participate, not in the subsequent rounds, but in this round today, where we have the largest and most active sample population of people who applied for this program because they were sold the dream that this would be something that would be fair and equitable. And so is it possible for that cutoff score to be implemented now, since it has been said that the administration could essentially do whatever it is that they want with these licenses? And if so, what is preventing that from happening?
Yeah, so Abraham, your question is, could there be a score, whether it's 90% above or the number and above, who qualify for the lottery? I know that's been bantered about. I don't know offhand whether that would require a change in law or whether that could be done by the administration by rule. I don't know if you guys know the answer to that. Mark's.
I don't think anything can be done for this round. I mean, what's in law
for
is
the
in
round
law.
that just, yeah, right. But I'm saying for the
Right,
subsequent
for future rounds. Well, absolutely. I mean, you guys write the law, so you can change the law.
But that was my point, is if it requires a change in law, and it very may well require a change in law to do it that way.
You'd have to again, to sort of accommodate both, you'd have to do one or the other. You'd either sort of have to allow a cutoff score that allows less than perfect applications to get in to the lottery or whatever, because again, the only way right now, the only teams who have made it at this point have perfect scores, plus they have 250 plus 2% extra credit, which requires them to be veterans.
Right.
So if you, let's say, let anyone from 245 on or 240 on, then you eliminate some of that issue. The other option is to do what we talked about before, which is to give veterans points, but not make it part of 51%. I think, me being the by far least smart person in this dialogue, I think you guys would have to change the law going forward.
And so let me address, would that solution make sense? I think it could to me. I think the goal here was never perfection. I think, perfect should not be the enemy of right, and good. Again, perfection it's just never something that was discussed. If it requires a change in law, and it very may well, that is very difficult. Number one, I think if we were to change it, whatever the threshold would be, you would want to say is a threshold that gives us confidence that the intent, big picture, is being met, right? And so where that line is, I think would require some input from legislators. And even more significantly is just the challenge of passing a law. I mean, we Mark, you and I, we kind of shrug our shoulders sometimes. We'll just change the law. You probably tell your clients this, though. That is no easy lift, changing law. We during COVID, this last spring, before COVID, Senator Staines, Representative Cassidy, myself, and others, kind of the core team who worked on this, we were getting together pre-COVID in a room, kind of talking about the issues. The governor, one of the questions that was posed was about the tiebreaker. Those types of issues were on the table. We were talking about, what do we do here? What's the right answer? We were getting some feedback from the administration. And we anticipated a change in law being put in place later in the spring 2020. And everything suggested that we were all marching in the same direction, that we were sorting out issues, and we were going to come together on a bill that would, modify the law in areas that could be helpful. COVID hit, and even through COVID, we negotiated significantly by Zoom and telephone and text and what have you. And we still came to an agreement on what that could look like. Wasn't perfect, but it addressed a number of issues. And then the governor pulled the rug out from under us in the 11th and a half hour, where we thought there was an agreement in place, and then the governor pulled out. And then nothing happened. And that reminds you, and maybe the governor had a good reason for doing so. Something wasn't in there that he had hoped for. I don't know. The point is, for all the hours that we worked on that effort, nothing ever came of it. I think the legislature may revisit some of this stuff. We may have good intentions, but getting to a point where you change the law is difficult. Lots of turns and twists along the way, which by design, I suppose, are there to make sure we don't change laws too easily.
Do you think, I mean, at the end of the day, do you think that the change in the law would, I mean, obviously you're the, what is it, the deputy leader or the,
Assistant Republican leader.
Right. So you know how to count votes.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't require a calculator, by the way. Count those noses.
Well, yeah. I mean, for some of us, we might still need a count, or at least we might need some tea and tea leaves to read before we can even count. But what's your say? Is this sort of a, realistically speaking, given the Republican minority, do you think this is, at the end of the day, something that Democrats can just do if they want, or do you think that the Republicans are going to have a substantive role to play?
Well, I think there's a substantive role to play. First of all, even since the initial bill, we've taken some votes on kind of trailer language, and Republicans have put a lot of votes on those bills. We knew what was in it. We negotiated it. It was a good process. Look, if the Democrats want to go down a path by themselves on any bill, they can. They have all the votes in the world. They got a governor of the same party. They can do whatever they want from that perspective. I do put a lot of faith in my colleague, Senator Staines, on this. Heather is, she really is someone who, we don't agree on all the big issues of the day, but she and I work very well together. I believe her when she says on this issue, Jason, I want Republican input. I think a lot, I can't speak for her on this, but for me, I think the product that comes from a bipartisan negotiation is often one that is better, that's more in line with what reasonable people in the state expect and want. And I think Republicans can absolutely play a significant role here. And we want to and are willing to, right? We've put our votes behind these things before. I certainly have. And I'm a solutions guy, actually, for those who still remember. Governor Jim Edgar is a friend and a mentor of mine. And he's one who, not to be real philosophical here, but he's one who's always told me, he's like, Jason, state government, any government, quite frankly, is not a place for ideologues. Government's a place for solutions, makers. And if you're a person who wants to solve problems and work together on solutions, there's a path. There is a clear path for you and role for you. And I embrace that holistically.
Yeah. Sometimes people ask me what a lobbyist does. I tell them it's sort of a job akin to a plumber. Probably even more so with you. You just got to make sure that stuff flows through the pipes without getting stuck.
Lobbyists, I don't know, Mark, that they get, they're treated as well as plumbers. The thing is, lobbyists are just treated better than, legislators. We're the bottom of the barrel.
Hey, let's hope we're better paid than both.
There you
Abraham, any more? Well, not any more questions. Senator, hopefully you have about another 10 minutes to stay on with us for another few questions. I realize we're getting close to the 11 o'clock hour. We still have people watching live and lots of questions coming in. So, tell us when you're done, but let's just do another couple of questions if you can. Abraham, what do you got?
So there was actually a follow-up question and some comments that were made in the chat that the rulemaking process was used to help with rescoring, and therefore they're suggesting whether that's a possibility to use that to allow for that cutoff score within this round and make that cutoff score anywhere from 245 to 247 if they included the community engagement plan, which would then not require those last 5 additional points that were awarded from veterans. The question is, right now, the current proposal leaves those non-vets out, and they're going to continue to sue, and they're going to continue to hold up this lottery process. And there was an article today that was published by Mike from Grown In that suggested that the state promised that they wouldn't conduct a lottery until at least October 15th. From there, they're still up to 30 days to respond to the plaintiff complaints, pushing the lottery past October, which could then drag into November's veto session, which would then allow legislators to modify the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act before the new supplemental notices have been sent.
Senator, if I might just suggest, would you give all of us a quick primer on law versus rulemaking and what administrative decisions mean and what statutory law means and how one, is more flexible than the other?
Yeah, I mean, I can do my best at it. Basically, I teach a lot, and often I use the analogy that lawmakers, we create to some degree the bumpers in the bowling alley, and we say, okay, here's this and here's that, and then all the stuff in between those two bumpers are things that can be done by rule. The administration has got latitude to do things so long as they don't go outside of the parameters, right? And so, I mean, again, a really easy example is if the legislature said the speed can be 55 to 65 miles an hour. This isn't how it works, by the way. But if they said the speed limit can be 55 to 65 miles an hour, then the administration can pick a number in between, but it can't go below 55 or above 65, right? And so that's why I raised the point earlier on the scoring. I don't know, and I was looking at the question there. I don't know whether rules can be used to determine a threshold for which someone qualifies to be entered into the lottery. If rules can be used to establish that, then the governor can act alone. He could do that, and in the next round, he could use that process if he so chooses. If in fact it requires, before we could do this, a change in law, and it may. If it requires a change in law to set that, then my point earlier was, I think there's logic to us doing that, but where that is would be subject to a legislative debate and negotiation. Some would say it should be here, some would say it should be there. They'd have the reasons. Someone posted in the comments, they said, what does a veteran score even have to do with cannabis? That's the same type of questions that go into a legislative discussion. The point, though, is one path is wildly easier than the other.
Yeah.
If the governor can do it by rule, then he can. It's not as simple as snap his fingers and go, but it's pretty dang easy. If it requires a change in law, that's a tough path. There's only limited opportunities to do that. The fall veto session could be one. There's going to be a lot of oxygen taken up in that fall veto session on things like criminal justice reform and ethics issues. The governor wants to tackle some energy issues. Throwing cannabis in the pot, there I go again, makes for a very busy fall veto session. And look, all of us, every lawmaker would say, we're there for as long as need be to get through the issues of the day. I just recognize that when you start adding all of these things to the agenda, it makes it more difficult to get all of them done.
And in terms of law versus rule, if you guys go, because again, I think these particular questions, you know, in regard to cutoffs and veterans, some people still intend them very much within the context of this current licenses that are out. And so I just want to, you know, touch on the fact that you guys are sort of restricted from retroactive, like you couldn't go pass a law that says we're changing the, you know, the goalposts for the first round of licenses that were done under the previous law legally.
Yeah, we could do it, and there would be a whole plethora of lawsuits saying you can't do that because of right, so just general principles of law, right? It's not fair to change the rules after people have spent all the time, money, and energy getting to where they're at in the process. Absolutely.
Great. And, you know, we're getting some great questions that maybe indicate to Abraham and me that we should maybe have Senator Barickman back for like a legislative making 101 if you're willing to come back, because you're good at explaining it. But I think, you know, people are still very, you know, and it's sad that the people who are impacted by this very process are still having to sort of on their own ferret out how to navigate the state and what can be possible and what isn't. And the only way to do that is to, like, you know, hopefully the free way to do that is try to be on something like this and listen. You know, the more expensive way is to hire you somebody to figure it out, which is always unfortunate. So
let me just chime in real quick too. I think Diane posed a kind of a follow-up question. You know, how do you figure it out? It's not rocket science to figure it out. I just can't answer that off the cuff here. Some level of analysis is required to say what can the administration do by rule versus what can be done by law on any issue, right? And so on the issue of scoring and how the lottery would work, to me, that's maybe the governor has an answer to that already as to which way it can be done. I simply don't know the answer. I could analyze it and figure it out, but I just don't know off the cuff here.
well, and you know, to some extent, given the timeline, the only person whose answer matters at this point is the only person who could act on that answer, and that's the governor, right? So, I mean, until you guys get back and do what you do, you know, we're all counting on his interpretation.
Yep.
And by the way, I want to say that I commend JB Pritzker, because I don't think, and part of this, his team served him well. I don't think they communicated well on his behalf. And again, that's my opinion, not yours. I obviously, the mistakes, a lot of this was just self-imposed wounds. And I think he was really, that showed true leadership to step forward and look at the camera and say, I'm not interested in protecting a process that people don't have a faith in. Because, you know, the first impulse of that kind of situation is say, we did everything right. You know, if there was anything wrong, it's somebody else's fault. So, Abraham, one last question. And by the way, Jason Barickman is a much better multitasker than Mark Basikovich, because he can do the questions without help from us, while I can't. But Abraham, make yourself useful.
So the last question that we have that we can close on, it comes from one of our members, Salvatore. His question is, what's the biggest hurdle for Republicans with supporting cannabis? And for the ones who do support it, what is it that they mainly support it, and what's holding them back?
Yeah, you know, that's what a great question. I can only speak for myself and kind of my experiences. Look, maybe there's a generational issue that exists that's a little different for me than some of my colleagues that explains some of that. But I think there's a divide in the Republican Party that is becoming more and more evident. And I certainly come from, well, before I get there, I guess I'd say this divide has been one that is somewhat ideological, It plays out in cannabis. When I mentioned earlier, I did all these town halls in all these towns that I represent. And I would have people of all age groups stand up, and some would say, I am just morally opposed to, people using cannabis or drugs or, what have you. And I get that, right? I mean, I respect people. Those are choices people make. But for me, that feeling of right and wrong, though it can exist with an individual, is not one for me to impose upon the government. I look at cannabis, again, it's an individual choice. And I think government's supposed to get out of the way of people making their own choices. That's Barickman's approach to this issue. It's not all Republicans' approach to it. Now, I think when I started speaking I was the first Republican who spoke out on this, I believe, some years ago, in Illinois at least. And when I did, it drew some attention and, it did what it did. But I'll tell you what else it did is it spurred a lot of conversations with my constituents and with my colleagues. And there was a lot of people who told me, Jason, I agree with your approach. I'm not going to go out there and broadcast it myself. There's a reason we elect you and not me. And part of that is you need to go carry the message and you need to vocalize these views. And so that's what I do. I think it's really easy to poll the audience on this type of an issue and find lots of people who might say, well, no, I don't think legalization is right. But if you actually sit down and you talk them through why this can be a good public policy and why it's the right answer and how it can be done, you see minds shift rapidly from that.
Senator, this has just been a great conversation. We're already well past an hour. Will you, once you know any more than you do now, will you come back and talk to us again? Maybe closer to veto session?
Yeah, no, I mean, these are great ways to interact, especially given COVID, where we can't all be face to face. But I'd be glad to do that. I shared my email on the chat, jason@jasonbarickman.com. I'm glad to talk more offline with individuals on any specifics that they want anytime. And yeah, Mark, I'm glad to come back and from the comfort of my own office here and speak with you more once we do know more. And I do think as fall veto comes, we're going to know a lot more on this.
Well, I look behind you on your shelves and on what is, from my perspective, the left top, there's, I think, a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And that
next to the littlest Barickman, yes.
Perhaps the next Abraham Lincoln. But, just as I looked over there and as we're wrapping this up, it just occurred to me that this is sort of done in the best of traditions of that individual and what that image stands for, and dialogue and tolerance and imperfection and tolerance of imperfection. Just thank you very much. You are a really, really reasonable, bright voice. I think people tend to agree when they see somebody actually gives a crap and thinks this stuff through. They don't, and so I think people really appreciated it. Much respect from us and thousands of people in our community. And, if we can ever help you convey the message that you want to convey to important stakeholders in this industry, we're here for you. Thank you very much, Senator, and have a great day.
All right.
Jason, Senator Jason, where can people learn more about you and reach out? I know you dropped your email, but is there somebody that where people can connect?
Yeah, so email, I'm on Twitter, jasonbarickman.com, jasonbarickman.org. I think my wife's on Pinterest. If you Google me, you will find out more than you'll ever want to know. But thank you for asking.
That is perfect. Thank you so much. And with that, to our guests, thank you so much for making the time to attend us this morning. And we look forward to having all of you here again.
Thanks to you and your staff, Senator.
Sure.
Have a good rest of your day, guys.